Controllers. They didn't always used to be this Controllers. They didn't always used to be this good. Let's look at the evolution of comfortability. Hey Retro Renegades, thank you guys very much for joining me for episode 3. Today I'd like to talk to you guys about controllers, specifically what controllers were really comfortable and what kind of sucked. Some of these are classics. Some of these are controllers that we've loved for a really long time. Some of these are controllers that you would be like, what? That's a great controller. Well, if you look at it close enough, maybe it's not. If we're gonna look at controllers, let's look at one of the originals, the OGs, the Nintendo Entertainment System controller. Oh, a classic, the original Nintendo Entertainment System controller. Nothing great to look at initially, just a square design edge, D-pad, select and start button, and your B and A button. Unfortunately, the Nintendo controller to these days' standards does not match up. The D-pad corners dig into your thumbs. It's blister central the moment you start using that thing anytime you need to navigate around the D-pad. The sides are sharp. Might as well have razor blades on this thing. Good news is they came out with a controller after the NES that worked wonders. That is the Super Nintendo controller. An upgrade in every way. They've moved to a 6-button layout, which gave you a Y, X, B, A button, as well as L and R buttons on the top. Wow, this has 6 buttons. The Super Nintendo controller was a thing of beauty. Rounded edges, perfect button layout, a crazy comfortable D-pad, and a controller that you can use for long periods of gameplay. That is comfortable. So things are going well. The Super Nintendo controller is awesome. How in the world are they going to beat that? Well, they figured it out. They won't. What? Enter the Nintendo 64 controller. Just when you thought things couldn't get any better, they go ahead and make something stupid like this. Let's make a controller that requires 3 hands to use it. Let's confuse our general customer. See if they can figure it out. It'll be like a puzzle. They'll have to figure out how to use the controller. We have a good idea. Let's make a joystick that hurts the hell out of your thumb and wears out after a year or two, just when you thought you couldn't add any more buttons. In comes the Z button. There's another button! I think people have learned to appreciate the Nintendo 64 controller, but during its time, man, it was a piece of crap. The console wars were heating up. Do you think Sega could have done it better? Let's find out. The Sega Genesis controller was a little bit larger than the Nintendo controller, and it had a sleek black design. Unfortunately, it only came with 3 buttons, and the competing Nintendo controller had 6. Wow, this has 6 buttons. This caused issues for games that required you to use more than those 3 buttons. One that I can come to mind is Street Fighter. Fortunately, you try to play Street Fighter, and you have to press the start button just to switch between your punches and kicks. The D-pad was pretty good, but still had sharp edges, tended to be still uncomfortable, just like the NES controller was. Oh, my thumb is gonna hurt after playing games with this for too long. But the lack of buttons tends to bring it down on the totem pole of controllers. I present to you the 6-button Sega Genesis controller. Pretty much upgraded in every way. They reduced the controller's size, they added 6 buttons, 3 concave on the bottom, and 3 rounded buttons on the top. They also upgraded the D-pad. It's almost on a swivel, and they've rounded these corners. This was a really cool controller because it gave you an opportunity to feel like you were playing in the arcades. To this day, the 6-button Sega Genesis controller is the one you want to get for the console. So the Sony PlayStation went from this to this. Let's add some joysticks. Let's round out the edges. We'll fix the bumpers as well as the triggers, and we'll add some motion sensitivity to it. I say Sony figured it out. Sony PlayStation. As you can tell, Sony modeled their controller closely after the Super Nintendo controller. They just elongated the handles and added an extra L and R button to the back sides. Unfortunately, the controller to today's standards just does not fit right. It's very stiff. The controller has a little bit of a rough edge to it. The buttons feel okay for the most part, but the D-pad is pretty horrendous, and there's the absence of the joysticks. And the controller itself is pretty small, but PlayStation had a trick up its sleeve. Say hello to the DualShock controller. This actually resembled the original design of the controller pretty well, other than they've added analog sticks to the bottom of the controller. They also changed the format of the back bumpers and trigger buttons. Now this version is a DualShock 3 controller. There was a DualShock 1 and 2 before it, which was roughly similar with a little bit of design tweaks. The DualShock controller didn't really change over 10 years of design. They added things like wireless function, and then also changed the triggers a little bit. But overall, the control was the same. Unfortunately, these controllers are kind of small. Do I just have King Kong hands? Sony was getting somewhere, but they needed to change the controller up just a little bit. With the next edition of the DualShock controller, Sony figured it out. This is the DualShock 4. Could you possibly make a controller right in every way imaginable? The answer, my friends, is yes. They widened the controller base, extended the controller handles. They finally gave you triggers where your fingers wouldn't slip off. They added a touchpad, which was kind of cool at the time, and also motion control is available. The DualShock 4 is the most comfortable controller that I've ever used. DualShock 4, best controller yet on the Sony PlayStation. So you'd think with the history of controller design, you would get a manufacturer that'd get it right, and Microsoft entered the game. Unfortunately, Microsoft created the largest controller known to man. This is the Duke. The Duke controller is a monster. It even feels large in my hands. How could any 4-year-old hold this? The buttons were interesting. There was an inclusion of a white and black button, which is very strange. White and black? What does it even mean? The design resembles the Dreamcast controller, which also had a little bit of design issue with the triggers being too low. Half of the controller's real estate is just the jewel in the center. Xbox was all about pushing the envelope, so why not make a giant-ass controller that nobody can hold? A controller that's way too big for anybody's hands, button placement that is a little uncomfortable, and triggers that are so low you need an additional finger grown out of your palm to reach it. To this day, there is a fan base for the Duke controller. Microsoft was able to upgrade to probably the most comfortable controller ever made. You all know it and love it, the 360 controller. The 360 controller is smooth. It had a great texture to it. The button placement was perfect, still felt something to be desired with the D-pad, but they would correct that in a later revision. The triggers were just right, had enough spring to them. The 360 controller fits your hand ergonomically probably the best as any controller could. The inclusion of bumper buttons as well as triggers that felt really comfortable on your hand. Most people agree that the 360 controller is the best controller ever designed. Well, there you have it, a quick timeline of controllers from the Big Four. If you guys like the episode or you like what I got going on, please think about subscribing. And if you guys have any comments, please write them down below. I'd love to know what your favorite controller is, or maybe what you think the worst is. So until we meet again, take care.